A portrait hangs in silence, but the face is gone. Welcome to Voice Chronicles. I am your host, Hawthorne. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I always enjoy reading them. Now, let's begin the mystery. The annual summer exhibition at the Flaxborough Art Circle was not by tradition an affair to set pulses racing. Most years it produced a modest crop of still lifes, soft focus watercolours of the cathedral, and a few acrylic landscapes that owed more to postcards than plain air experience. The town dignitaries turned up for the opening, fortified by the prospect of sherry, while the rest of the public drifted through later in the week, remarking vaguely on brushwork before returning to their gardens or golf. This year's innovation, however, was the inclusion of a portrait class. The Circle's secretary, Mrs. Birtwistle, had argued that nothing demonstrated artistic seriousness, so well as a few canvases of actual people, recognisably so. Portraiture, she declared in the Flaxborough Gazette, lent dignity to an exhibition otherwise too given to decorative whimsy. The outcome was a row of earnest likenesses in oils, pastels, and the occasional experiment in charcoal. Some were recognisable. Mrs. Birtwistle herself, square-jawed and glossy as a sideboard, glared from one frame. Councillor Cobbold, rendered in pastel, had the look of a man baffled by arithmetic. It was during the mayor's opening remarks, the mayor being Alderman Peever, who spoke at length about cultural horizons while keeping one eye on the buffet, that a murmur ran along the front row. A lady in a floral hat gave a stifled squeak, followed by the words, "Well, really?" in a tone that suggested both outrage and faint admiration. The cause of her exclamation soon spread among the gathering. Hanging between the portrait of Mrs. Birtwistle and the pastel Cobbold was a canvas depicting a gentleman in a black jacket, white shirt, and neatly tied cravat. The hair was perfectly in place. The shoulders, hands, and chair were faithfully represented. The face, however, was quite absent. Not merely vague, nor clumsily drawn. Absent. The head rose from the shirt collar in proper outline, but where features should have been, there was only a pale blank, as though some fastidious vandal had erased them. Not a smudge, not a brushstroke, just emptiness. Mrs. Birtwistle, who had the prerogative of indignation, pushed her way to the front. This, she announced to no one in particular, was not present yesterday evening. I hung the works myself. Her emphasis on personal involvement was a weapon sharpened over decades of committee service. "But who?" began Councillor Cobbold, then checked himself. The suggestion that someone might know the answer carried dangers, especially when Mrs. Birtwistle was scanning faces for culprits. The mayor, weighing his responsibilities against the need not to prolong proceedings, attempted a compromise. "Art," he pronounced, "is ever liable to interpretive difficulty. Perhaps the artist intended a commentary upon anonymity." This was not successful. The floral-hatted lady sniffed. "Rubbish." "It's wicked, that's what it is." From the back, Mr. Gloss, the stationer, put in dryly, "If you ask me, it's an improvement." He did not specify upon whom. The excitement spread beyond the town hall. By the time Inspector Purbright, returning from a minor interview with the borough surveyor about a stolen set of drain keys, passed through the market square, he could hear clumps of people speculating in tones usually reserved for engagements and influenza. Someone slipped in overnight. Deliberate insult to Mrs. Birtwistle, mark my words. No, it was political. Peever's enemies, you'll see. The inspector, a tall, mild-looking man with a tendency to blink politely when others were indignant, listened without encouragement. He made no notes. He did, however, proceed towards the town hall at the same steady pace with which he might have gone to collect library books. Inside the exhibition room, Mrs. Birtwistle awaited him like a general standing before a breached fortification. She wasted no time. "Inspector Purbright, this is no mere accident. You will agree that faces do not simply vanish." Purbright studied the portrait. The blankness was, indeed, remarkable. Not a patch of scraped paint, nor a wash of colour. The absence had a quality of deliberation, almost finesse. "Curious?" he said gently. "Curious?" repeated Mrs. Birtwistle. "It is disgraceful, an outrage against culture." The inspector's eyes moved from the picture to the small brass plate fixed beneath it. The plate read, in careful capitals, "Mr. Hector Leathers, by Miss Flora Chubb." He blinked again. Hector Leathers was the town's undertaker, a man precise to the edge of morbidity, who had been known to lecture mourners on the correct handling of hatbands. Purbright said nothing of this. He simply inclined his head and asked, "Might I trouble you for the catalogue, Mrs. Birtwistle?" The secretary thrust it at him. He opened it, glanced at the entries, and closed it again with no sign of haste. Outside in the market square, the gossip had already moved ahead of him. Some were suggesting a personal quarrel. Others hinted that Mr. Leathers had, in some mysterious way, provoked a grudge. By tea-time, half the town would have a theory. By tomorrow, at least 3 would involve illegitimate children. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, strolled back towards the police station, carrying the catalogue neatly under his arm. He appeared, to a casual eye, to be thinking of nothing in particular. But as he reached the station steps, he paused for just a second, looking up at the cloudy sky with that faint expression of someone who has observed something both ridiculous and oddly serious. Then he went inside. The town of Flaxborough had always prided itself on being sensible. It was the sort of place where even the fiercest quarrels over allotment boundaries or the conduct of the library committee were conducted with civility, and where the extraordinary was expected to behave itself. To discover, then, that a portrait's face had simply melted away into nothingness was not a matter easily absorbed into the civic digestion. By late evening, the story had spread into every quarter of the town, and with the speed that only a combination of telephone and doorstep gossip could manage. At number 48, Wicket's Row, Mrs. Dolly Blenkinsop, whose interest in art did not extend beyond embroidery patterns in Woman's Friend, described it to her neighbour as a picture of a man who's been done in, proper rubbed out, like with a duster. By the time her neighbour repeated this to her husband, a bus conductor, it had become a portrait of someone they'd wiped clean off, for reasons best not discussed. The conductor, having a natural gift for oratory, later enlarged upon the subject in the snug of the 8 Kings. He confided to his audience that the police were keeping the whole matter hushed, but that he had it on the very best authority the face was missing because the fellow had been found dead earlier that day and the artist had been tipped off. No one asked which authority he meant, perhaps because the explanation, while unlikely, possessed just the right amount of menace to be satisfactory. Elsewhere, explanations developed with regional variety. In the hairdressers on Willow Lane, it was decided the whole thing was to do with hypnotism, a subject Mrs. Platt had read about in The People's Friend. At the Conservative Club, the blame was laid squarely on modern art, which never paints a proper picture anyway. At St. Saviour's Mothers' Union, the theory was floated that it was a cruel joke directed at Miss Flora Chubb, who was known to be easily embarrassed, and had once fainted during a rehearsal of Merry Wives of Windsor. Meanwhile, Miss Chubb herself was doing her best to avoid notice. A quiet, timid young woman who worked as a clerk at the Borough Rates Office, she was mortified by the attention her canvas had attracted. At home that night she refused supper, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands clenched and her eyes staring at nothing. Her mother, a large woman with a voice built for market haggling, tried to comfort her with assurances that everybody will have forgot by tomorrow. But Miss Chubb, who possessed more sensitivity than her neighbours appreciated, had the miserable conviction that tomorrow the matter would be larger still. Inspector Purbright at his desk was neither enlarging the affair nor dismissing it. He had, in his quiet way, allowed Sergeant Love to recount the various rumours that had come in via the station telephone. Love, whose appetite for information was large, but whose digestion of it was poor, delivered each in tones that suggested the case of the century was upon them. "They say, sir," he concluded breathlessly, "that Mr. Leathers himself wouldn't set foot near the exhibition this evening, refused point-blank, just walked away from the town hall without a word." Purbright looked up mildly. "Did they, Love? How enterprising of them." "Yes, sir. Now I was thinking—" "That," said Purbright, kindly but firmly, "can always be left until later." He leaned back in his chair. "I think we might begin tomorrow by speaking with Miss Chubb. The artist, after all, may know how her subject managed to lose his face." Love frowned, disappointed. "Do you suppose it's some kind of paint that fades, sir?" "I should imagine Miss Chubb would have noticed before hanging it," Purbright replied. He reached for the day's Gazette, folded it carefully, and set it aside. The following morning was damp, the kind of half-hearted drizzle Flaxborough specialized in. Miss Chubb, making her way to the rates office, found herself greeted with more glances than usual. A group of schoolchildren passed her with the exaggerated solemnity of those aware of scandal. At the corner, near the Corn Exchange, Mrs. Gloss, wife of the stationer, gave her a smile whose sweetness was intended to disguise curiosity. Miss Chubb flushed crimson and hurried indoors. By 11's, however, she was summoned to the police station. She sat in the interview room, her hat clutched tightly in her lap, while Inspector Purbright regarded her with his customary expression of polite interest. "I am sorry to trouble you, Miss Chubb," he began, "but it would help us if you could tell us a little about your portrait of Mr. Leathers." Miss Chubb swallowed nervously. "It was only a likeness, sir. I asked him if he would sit, and he agreed. Only he didn't have much patience. I had to make do with a few sittings, and then I worked from memory." "Very natural. And when you completed the work, did you notice anything unusual about the features?" Her eyes widened. "No, sir. The face was there. I painted it quite carefully. He said he thought it made him look unbusinesslike, but I thought it was very like him, his eyes especially." "And you last saw the portrait intact when?" "On Tuesday evening, when we hung them in the hall. It was quite late, but I'm sure of it." Purbright inclined his head. "Thank you. That helps." She hesitated, then burst out, "Inspector, I didn't do it. Whatever they say, I wouldn't. I couldn't." The inspector blinked gently. "I'm not suggesting you did, Miss Chubb. Only that you may have noticed something or someone." She shook her head, close to tears, and, after a few more polite questions, was allowed to go. When she had left, Sergeant Love leaned across the table. "What do you make of it, sir? Seems to me either she's lying or else someone slipped in after hours and tampered with it." Purbright nodded faintly. "Yes, quite possibly one or the other." He did not enlarge upon which he thought more likely. By lunchtime the town's appetite for speculation had become insatiable. At least two versions of events involved séances. One implicated the Labour Club, and another hinted at a feud within the undertaker's trade. At the barber's, a customer suggested darkly that the erasure was symbolic, a warning to Leathers about his business practices. This was accepted with the seriousness normally reserved for horse racing tips. Hector Leathers himself, however, offered no enlightenment. When Purbright visited his establishment that afternoon, he found the undertaker in his office among polished coffins and the faint odour of polish. Mr. Leathers, a gaunt man with hair slicked so firmly back that it seemed afraid to disobey him, was characteristically grave. "A most distasteful episode, Inspector," he said. "An insult to myself, of course, but also to the good taste of the town. I am astonished such a thing could occur in the town hall." "You did not then approve of the likeness?" Purbright asked mildly. Leathers's lips compressed. "I did not. I never approve of portraits. The dead, Inspector, are properly presented with dignity. The living ought not to be attempted in oils. It encourages vanity." Purbright regarded him for a moment. "I see. And yet you agreed to sit for Miss Chubb?" "A mistake," Leathers admitted. "One of those errors into which politeness occasionally drives one." He said no more, and Purbright, after a courteous pause, took his leave. He had learned little, but the manner of Mr. Leathers's disdain was itself a kind of evidence. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was eager for some decisive statement. "So it was Leathers himself, sir? Got in there late and wiped it off?" "Perhaps," said Purbright, without committing himself. He gazed thoughtfully at the drizzle beading the window. Or perhaps someone wished to suggest just that. Outside, the gossip deepened. By evening, the missing face had ceased to be a puzzle and had become a certainty in the minds of most citizens. It was proof of a quarrel, an affair, or a scandal of the kind Flaxborough always suspected just beneath its neat surface. Inspector Purbright, walking home at a steady pace, allowed the rain to dampen his hat without concern. His thoughts, as usual, were concealed behind his mild eyes. But as he passed the town hall once more, he glanced up at the dark windows and allowed himself the faintest of smiles, one that might have meant amusement or patience, or simply the awareness that whatever lay beneath this curious blankness was not quite so simple as Flaxborough believed. By the following morning the affair had achieved that curious Flaxborough transformation, whereby fact became, seasoning and speculation, the solid dish. The market was alive with versions of the missing face, served with the confidence of long-established truth. At Mrs. Prowse's greengrocer's, customers discussed it over lettuces. At the post office, it had been reduced to shorthand, the blank portrait business, requiring no further explanation. Inspector Purbright, beginning his day with a cup of lukewarm tea at his desk, had the Gazette laid neatly beside him. The paper's front page bore a photograph of the portrait itself, taken in dramatic black and white by the town's sole freelance photographer, Mr. Ferret. The caption read, "History at the Town Hall. Whose hand erased the undertaker?" Sergeant Love entered with a bundle of notes and the air of a man who had gathered intelligence of pressing importance. "Sir, you'll be interested to know Mr. Leathers has been seen twice this morning, once at the chemist's and once walking down Ferry Street. People say he looked, well, odd, staring straight ahead, lips moving." Purbright looked up mildly. "Talking to himself, perhaps?" "Yes, sir, that's what they say." The inspector stirred his tea. "I should not be surprised if many people in Flaxborough have been talking to themselves since yesterday." Love looked disappointed but rallied. "Also, sir, Mrs. Gloss says she overheard a remark in the market. Somebody said Miss Chubb and Mr. Leathers were, friendly." He coloured faintly, though in what way I couldn't say. Purbright blinked. "I imagine neither could they." Nevertheless, the suggestion lingered. By midday it had circulated as established fact that Miss Chubb, the shy clerk from the rates office, had been in thrall to the undertaker. This gave the gossip greater vigour and Miss Chubb herself greater misery. At the rates office she suffered the sidelong glances of colleagues who pretended to be busy at ledgers. At lunchtime she fled to the ladies' room and sat with her face in her hands, praying that Inspector Purbright would somehow end the torment quickly. Meanwhile, the inspector was not in any rush. He preferred, as always, to let facts unfold at their own pace, like plants obliged to reveal their nature when watered with patience. In the afternoon, he and Sergeant Love walked over to the town hall to examine the room once more. The caretaker, a lugubrious man named Crampton, showed them in with an air of personal affront. "I locked this place at 10 sharp, Inspector. Always have done. No one could get in without I knew it. Unless, of course," he drew himself up, "somebody has a duplicate key, which would be shocking." Purbright studied him with polite attention. "Do many people hold keys, Mr. Crampton?" "Only officials," said Crampton darkly. "Members of the council, Mrs. Birtwistle, the mayor, and 1 or 2 others. They shouldn't, mind you. They've no call to be letting themselves in." The inspector inclined his head. "Thank you. That may be useful." When Crampton had departed, Purbright walked slowly about the hall. He stopped before the altered portrait, tilting his head slightly as though in contemplation of some private thought. "Love," he said at last. "What does it remind you of?" Love scratched his head. "Remind me of, sir? A shop window dummy, perhaps, or a ghost." Purbright smiled faintly. "Yes, something of that sort." He took out his handkerchief and dabbed at a corner of the frame. No dust came away. Curious. Whoever interfered was careful. As they left the town hall, they encountered Mrs. Birtwistle herself, marching in with her usual determination. She stopped them with a raised hand. "Inspector, I have received complaints. Visitors are suggesting this outrage is a publicity stunt. They appear to believe the art circle contrived it in order to attract attention. I cannot have the reputation of the circle sullied by such imputations." Purbright bowed his head gravely. "Reputations are precious things, Mrs. Birtwistle. I shall do my best to see that yours is preserved intact." This answer both soothed and baffled her, which Purbright seemed to find satisfactory. That evening, the town acquired a new story to set beside the old. Mr. Leathers, it was said, had been heard in his yard shouting at an employee, a youth named Billy Peggs. The words were indistinct, but the tone suggested fury. By the time the tale reached the snug of the 8 Kings, it had become a full-blown quarrel over money, and Mr. Peggs was said to have stormed away vowing vengeance. Purbright heard this report the next morning, delivered by Love with relish. He nodded, but made no immediate comment. Instead, he asked the sergeant to find out whether Billy Peggs had been anywhere near the town hall in recent days. It was while Love was away on this errand that Purbright received a caller of his own. Miss Chubb's mother, Mrs. Chubb, arrived at the station, a formidable figure in a hat of black straw and feathers that trembled with indignation. She demanded to see the inspector, and upon being admitted to his office, sat heavily in the chair opposite his desk. "My daughter," she declared, "is being persecuted. She has done nothing wrong, yet people cross the street to avoid her. They whisper, they point. It is wicked." Purbright regarded her calmly. "I am sorry to hear that, Mrs. Chubb. I can assure you the police are not encouraging such behaviour." "That may be. But you must clear her name. Say something in the Gazette. Tell them she is innocent." Purbright steepled his fingers. "At present, Mrs. Chubb, she is neither guilty nor innocent. She is merely the painter of a portrait, and until we know who altered it, her position cannot be better defined." This did not satisfy Mrs. Chubb, but she left eventually, muttering threats against the Gazette. Purbright returned to his paperwork with the unruffled calm of a man long accustomed to the storms of mothers. When Love came back, he reported that Billy Peggs had indeed been seen near the town hall the previous evening. "Larking about with some other lads, sir. Not that that proves anything." "Quite so," said Purbright. He closed a file, looked out of the window for a moment, and then added, "We shall have to speak with him, I think." But gently. Youths often reveal more than they intend when not pressed too hard. And with that he rose, took his hat, and led the way out. The town, meanwhile, continued to ferment. By the end of the week, the portrait was the subject of more speculation than the Borough Council's proposed new car park, which was in itself a remarkable achievement. The missing face had become, in Flaxborough's collective mind, not simply an art oddity, but a sign of what no one could say, but a sign nonetheless. Inspector Purbright, however, continued to move at his own pace. He knew that gossip was like yeast. Given time, it swelled beyond reason, and in so doing revealed the shape of the vessel that contained it. The interview with Billy Peggs was arranged for the following afternoon. Sergeant Love, who felt instinctively that the boy must have had a hand in the business, treated it with the eagerness of a hound taken out on a lead. Billy himself, a lanky youth of 17 with a permanent slouch and hair that seemed to grow against any comb, entered the station with the expression of someone prepared for injustice. He wore his best jacket, though the buttons did not quite match, and he sat in the chair across from Inspector Purbright as if it were a trap designed to spring shut. "Now then, Mr. Peggs," Purbright began in his gentle voice, "I wonder if you would mind telling us about your evening near the town hall." Billy shuffled. "Didn't do nothing, just with the lads. We was only having a look." "A look at what?" asked Love sharply. Billy glanced at him, resentful. "At the pictures, weren't we? Wanted to see the daft paintings. Only we couldn't, on account of it being locked up." "So you didn't go inside?" "Number course not." He looked affronted, as though the suggestion of his possessing initiative were unfair. "Only daft folk goes inside art places." Love glared. "And you had no quarrel with Mr. Leathers?" Billy gave a short laugh. "Him! Miserable old crow, he's always bawling at me. But I don't take no notice. He'd bawl at the Queen if she crossed his yard." Purbright, who had been watching the boy's fingers pick at a loose thread on his jacket, asked mildly, "Do you remember if Mr. Leathers was there that evening?" Billy thought, then shook his head. "Didn't see him, didn't want to." The interview lasted another 10 minutes, during which Billy's innocence, though not proven, seemed wrapped in the sort of lethargy that did not easily translate into secret acts of artistry. Love remained dissatisfied, but Purbright closed the matter politely and let the boy go. "That one's guilty of something, sir," Love muttered as the door closed. "Very likely," said Purbright, "but perhaps not of this." The sergeant, deprived of certainty, sought it elsewhere. By tea-time, he had developed the theory that Miss Chubb was responsible after all. "Think of it, sir. She paints the portrait, then doesn't like it. Perhaps she thinks it makes her look foolish, or else Mr. Leathers said something sharp, and she took offence, so she goes back and wipes it off." "Wipes it off?" Purbright repeated, "without leaving any trace of wiping." Love hesitated. "Well, it scrapes it then, or paints over it." "Ah," Purbright murmured. "So she replaced a face with nothing, yet left no sign of paint." He smiled faintly. "It seems Miss Chubb has talents beyond her water-colours." The sergeant coloured, but did not abandon the notion. Nor did others. By evening, the town's conversational tide had swung toward Miss Chubb with a relish that mixed pity with accusation. To believe she had acted in desperation, spite at rejection, mortification at ridicule, was both plausible and satisfying. It provided the neatness Flaxborough craved. At the Eight Kings, Mr. Gloss declared it was a case of female nerves, bound to end in mischief. At the Ladies' Guild, Mrs. Peever hinted that Miss Chubb had always been rather unstable. Even at the barber's, where male grievances usually monopolized discussion, the consensus was that women and paint were a dangerous combination. Purbright, listening to these currents without ever wading into them, maintained his quiet detachment. One evening he strolled to the market, ostensibly to buy tobacco, and overheard a pair of townsmen discussing the matter in front of the fishmongers. "She's got a crush on him, that's the thing, and when he told her to clear off, bang, she went and wiped his mug clean." "Better off without it, I reckon," said the other. "Leathers's mug would spoil any picture." Purbright bought his tobacco, thanked the tobacconist, and walked back slowly, turning the packet over in his fingers. He made no effort to counter the tide, for he knew tides went out again and often revealed what had been hidden beneath. Miss Chubb herself was by now a figure of tragic notoriety. She stayed away from work 2 mornings running, claiming illness, and when she ventured out she walked quickly, head bent. Her mother stormed around the town with threats of lawsuits, but her bluster only added to the conviction that the girl was guilty. Nothing persuaded Flaxborough like indignation. That week a borough council meeting gave the matter its most public airing. Councillor Cobbold rose ponderously to declare that the town hall must in future be fitted with additional locks. "It is intolerable," he boomed, "that the civic dignity of Flaxborough should be placed in jeopardy by the whims of young women with unstable brushes." From the gallery came a hiss, which may have been Mrs. Chubb. The chairman rapped for order, but the sentiment had already been delivered and found receptive ears. Afterwards, in the council anteroom, Purbright found himself addressed by Alderman Peaver, who lowered his voice to the confidential growl he reserved for the police. "I trust, Inspector, you will take steps to conclude this unfortunate affair quickly. A simple statement will do, something to restore confidence. You know how people are." "Yes," said Purbright blandly, "they are very good at knowing how other people are." This remark was too oblique for the alderman, who merely harumphed and left. That evening, Purbright sat at his desk with the portrait catalogue once more open before him. He studied the list of entries, his finger resting lightly upon 1 or 2 names. Then he closed it, put it away, and sat motionless for several minutes, gazing into the quiet office air. Sergeant Love, returning from an errand, found him so and asked, "Thinking it over, sir?" Purbright blinked. "Not so much thinking, Love. More allowing it to arrange itself." Love looked puzzled, but said no more. By then the town had already arranged the matter for itself. The obvious suspect was Miss Flora Chubb. That she denied it mattered little, that she lacked opportunity still less. Flaxborough wanted an ending, and she provided one. Only Inspector Purbright remained unconvinced. He continued to move at his own pace, polite, patient, waiting for the trivial but telling thing that he suspected must, sooner or later, make itself visible. The portrait remained on its hook in the town hall, attracting visitors far beyond the art circle's normal constituency. Flaxborough had never shown much appetite for canvases, but this one, stripped of its features, had become the town's most compelling spectacle since the fire at the wholesale drapery warehouse. People queued in 2s and 3s to gaze at it, shaking their heads as though in judgment upon a badly pruned rosebush. It was during one of these quiet inspections, a Tuesday morning of thin sunlight, that Inspector Purbright returned to the hall. He moved politely among the small groups of visitors, attracting no more attention than a tall man with a calm face and slightly outdated hat. He paused before the portrait, studied it for a while, and then allowed his eyes to wander across the surrounding frames. Mrs. Birtwistle, bustling about with catalogue in hand, was quick to pounce. "I don't suppose there is any progress, Inspector?" she demanded. "Progress," Purbright said mildly, "is often less obvious than one might hope." "Then you have no suspect?" He blinked. "Oh, I think I may have 1 or 2, but I should hate to deprive the town of its pleasure in guessing." This answer earned him a suspicious glare, but she was diverted by another visitor's request for directions to the washroom. Purbright continued his inspection in peace. It was then that he noticed something peculiar. Beneath the blank portrait, on the narrow dado rail that ran around the hall, was a faint smudge. He bent slightly, brushed it with a fingertip, and examined the result. A trace of powder, pale grey. Not dust, but something finer, like the residue of chalk. He straightened, slipped his handkerchief discreetly over his fingers, and continued walking as though nothing had occurred. Later, back at the station, he asked Sergeant Love if any of the artists had worked in charcoal. Love thumbed through the catalogue with great ceremony. "Yes, sir. 3 entries. There's a study of a farm gate by a chap named Hardy, a self-portrait by Miss Willis, and, an interior scene, Stillness, by Reverend Mr. Thorkel." "Ah," Purbright murmured. "Charcoal does travel, doesn't it? Very easily. A smudge here, a smear there." He folded his hands. "It is often overlooked." Love frowned. "Do you mean someone smudged the painting with charcoal, sir?" "Perhaps," said Purbright. "Or perhaps they were careless enough to leave behind a trace of their working material." The sergeant looked puzzled, then brightened. "We could test it, sir. Send it off to the lab." Purbright smiled kindly. "Our lab, Love, is not the sort that discovers much from grey smudges. I dare say this one will yield little more than confirmation of what we already know, that someone, somewhere, has been using charcoal." Love subsided, though still intrigued. That afternoon, Purbright made a point of visiting the Reverend Mr. Thorkel at the rectory. A tall, kindly clergyman with wild eyebrows and an absent-minded manner, he greeted the inspector with distracted warmth. "You'll have come about my contribution to the exhibition?" Thorkel said cheerfully. "A dreadful failure, I fear. Charcoal simply will not do what one tells it." Purbright smiled. That must make it rather like people. The rector chuckled, then waved a hand vaguely. "I have 6 sketches lying about in the vestry. Smudges everywhere. Drives the verger to distraction. But I can't imagine what that has to do with your, investigation." "Neither can I yet," Purbright said politely, and let the conversation wander onto hymn numbers. When he left, he paused on the rectory steps, gazing at the neat beds of geraniums. His expression was as mild as ever, but his thoughts, unspoken, arranged themselves into their usual tidy rows. The smudge had been real enough, not proof, not even evidence, but something to notice. Meanwhile, the town was noticing other things. Mrs. Chubb had written an indignant letter to the Gazette, declaring her daughter persecuted. The Gazette, unable to resist, printed it with relish. The result was renewed gossip, now sharpened by indignation. Some believed Miss Chubb entirely innocent, others more guilty than ever. The undertaker, Hector Leathers, maintained his air of lofty disdain, refusing to comment to anyone save his assistant. And the assistant, Billy Peggs, spent his evenings brooding in the snug where his mutterings only fueled speculation. One evening, Sergeant Love returned from a round of listening in pubs with a face full of triumph. "Sir, it's all but confirmed. Peggs told someone Leathers has been hiding something, said he knew about it, and he'd make it known one of these days." Purbright looked up from his paperwork, his face betraying no surprise. "And this, Love, is now being repeated with improvements, no doubt?" "Yes, sir. Some say it's money, others, women." "Remarkable," said Purbright dryly, "how swiftly a smudge becomes a scandal." Love did not catch the metaphor. The following morning, Purbright took a slow walk through the market before calling at the town hall once again. The portrait hung in its usual place, mute, eyeless. He regarded it quietly, then turned away. To a casual observer, he appeared to have learned nothing, but to Purbright himself the detail of a smudge on a dado rail had begun to settle into place, beside the undertaker's disdain, Miss Chubb's misery, and the town's hunger for a culprit. and though he said nothing, he was faintly smiling again as he walked back towards the station, as though some absurdity, hidden from everyone else, had begun to amuse him. The widening of any investigation in Flaxborough was never a matter of the police alone. It was, instead, a kind of civic entertainment, an unspoken invitation for every inhabitant to bring forward suspicions, stories, and grievances, the vast majority of which had nothing at all to do with the case in hand. Inspector Purbright, accustomed to this theatre, allowed the first trickle to wash over him with his customary serenity. It began with a letter. Sergeant Love brought it in, sealed with green wax that had smudged untidily, and laid it on the inspector's desk with an air of significance. "Anonymous, sir. Posted last night." Purbright opened it delicately. The handwriting was a laborious, almost childish print. "The one you want is the little man with the dog. He was seen near the hall on Saturday night. Ask him about the girl from the library. He has a temper. Yours sincerely, a friend." Purbright folded the paper, placed it carefully in his drawer, and looked at Love. "Would you be good enough to find out how many little men with dogs there are in Flaxborough?" Love brightened. "Yes, sir," he returned an hour later, deflated. "9, sir. 4 terriers, 3 poodles, a dachshund, and a lurcher. I've written out their names." He handed over a sheet of foolscap. "Splendid," said Purbright. "Then we may proceed at leisure." The second expansion came in the form of Mrs. Sprod, a stout widow whose family had kept the milliner's shop until it failed in the face of cheaper imports. She called at the station with a look of tragic confidence. "I've no doubt at all," she said, "that my late husband's cousin is behind it. He always had a grudge against me. Said he would bring shame on my name. This would be just the sort of thing he'd do." Purbright inclined his head. "May I ask where your cousin lives, madam?" "In Ipswich," she said triumphantly. "Then perhaps we may exclude him," murmured the inspector. Mrs. Sprod seemed unmoved by exclusion. She left with the air of one who had at least discharged a civic duty. The third widening came, as Purbright had almost predicted, from the Gazette. The editor, a neat man named Ragg, telephoned with what he called a helpful lead. "I wouldn't mention it otherwise, Inspector, but you know as well as I do the connections between art and politics. One cannot help noticing that Councillor Grope was very put out when his own watercolour was refused for the exhibition, mightn't, spite of a rather juvenile nature, have had its expression in this, outrage." Purbright thanked him gravely, made a note, and afterwards tore it in half. By the middle of the week, the portrait itself had ceased to be the only curiosity. What people wanted now were suspects. Miss Chubb's name continued to circulate, but it had become less entertaining through overuse. The undertaker Leathers, austere and silent, was always worth a flutter, though his hauteur made it difficult to imagine him meddling with brushes. The rector, too, was mentioned, simply because charcoal was messy and clergymen were not expected to dabble in it. Amid this ferment, Purbright and Love paid a quiet call upon the library. The librarian, Miss Peeble, received them behind her desk like a headmistress confronted with errant boys. A pale, narrow woman in steel spectacles, she spoke in clipped phrases. "Yes, Inspector, some disturbance among the books last Saturday. The print section, shelves untidy, catalogue card misplaced. I noticed when I came in on Monday." "Nothing stolen?" "Not that I can yet discover, but the prints include works on technique, drawing, painting, charcoal." She gave him a sharp look, as though daring him to contradict the obvious link. "And the little man with the dog?" Purbright asked pleasantly. Her lips thinned. "Mr. Hargate, retired clerk, comes here daily, sits in the reading room, reads newspapers of 5 years ago, often accompanied by that dog of his, though he knows it isn't permitted. Has he a temper, would you say? He has a way of banging drawers. Purbright thanked her, promised to make inquiries, and withdrew. Outside, Sergeant Love was positively fizzing. "It fits, sir. The letter, the dog, the library. Shall we bring him in?" Purbright shook his head gently. "Not yet. For one thing, I should like to know more about the misplaced catalogue card. People seldom steal information they already possess." That evening, Purbright sat in his office while the gas fire ticked quietly. On his desk lay the anonymous letter, Mrs. Sprodd's complaint, Rag's hint about Councillor Grope, and Miss Peebles' report. They made a curious heap, scraps of suspicion, trivial in themselves, but together suggesting that the portrait's silent absence had touched some deeper unease in the town. It was never merely about paint, he reflected. It was about affront, about jealousy, about the innumerable irritations that simmered beneath polite surfaces. He leaned back, folded his arms, and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The investigation was spreading not outward but inward, down into the fine sediment of Flaxborough's social life. And if experience had taught him anything, it was that such sediment, once stirred, invariably threw up something quite different from what had been expected. Mr. Hargate, clerk retired, was the sort of man who gave the impression of having been misfiled in the great cabinet of creation. He was small but not neat, bald but not entirely, and carried himself with an air of officious disappointment, as though perpetually in search of a missing docket. His dog, a squat terrier named Pongo, compensated for his master's timidity by greeting strangers with a bravado of snarls and small, ill-meant leaps. Inspector Purbright found Hargate in his customary place in the public reading room, bent over a newspaper so far out of date that one might have mistaken him for a time traveller stranded in the year before last. "Good morning, Mr. Hargate," Purbright began politely. Hargate jerked, glanced up, then scowled with the resentful look of one who knows himself suspected. "If this is about that picture, I know nothing about it." Purbright's smile remained perfectly affable. "May I ask what picture you refer to?" "The one in the hall," Hargate muttered. "They all say I had a hand in it. Silly gossip." "Indeed. Then perhaps you might assist me." "You were seen, I believe, near the hall last Saturday evening?" "I walk Pongo most evenings," Hargate admitted. "There's no law against it." "None at all," Purbright agreed. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Hargate hesitated. His fingers fidgeted on the newsprint. Well, I did hear someone, in the shrubbery by the side path. A woman's voice, I think. She said something sharp. Couldn't make out the words. Then I heard feet hurrying away." "Not towards the town?" "No, the other direction. Towards the library." The inspector inclined his head. "Thank you, Mr. Hargate. And you are quite sure you saw no one else?" "No one," Hargate said quickly, and bent back to his paper as though to declare the interview at an end. Purbright, however, remained. "Might you recall, sir, whether your dog displayed any interest at the time?" Pongo, under the chair, growled faintly at the mention. "He sniffed about," Hargate admitted, "but then he always does." Purbright let the matter rest and withdrew. Outside, Sergeant Love could scarcely contain himself. "Well, that settles it, sir. He was there, he admits it, and he's evasive. And if it was a woman's voice he heard, why didn't he tell anyone sooner?" "Because, love," said Purbright gently, "to tell a story too soon is to lose control of it. People keep things back until they sense the right market." Love blinked. "You mean he's trying to sell his tale? Not in coin, perhaps, but in significance." They walked a little way in silence. Flaxborough's High Street, obediently busy with shoppers and prams, seemed indifferent to artistic outrage, And yet within the butchers, the ironmongers, and the tobacconists, the story of Hargate and the portrait was being embroidered, traded, and resold like contraband lace. That afternoon, Purbright received an unexpected visitor at the station, Mrs. Glossop, wife of a prosperous corn merchant and herself a noted patroness of cultural uplift. "I must speak with you, Inspector," she declared, seating herself without invitation. "It is about that dreadful Mr. Hargate. You know, of course, that he has always been unsuitable." "Entirely unsuitable." Purbright ventured a mild, "Unsuitable for what, precisely?" "For the company he insists upon keeping. The girl at the library desk. Impertinent creature. I have observed them talking, whispering, Inspector, and this at her place of employment. What do you suppose that means?" Purbright coughed discreetly. "The young lady being Miss Phipps, works under Miss Peeble, a flighty sort. I shouldn't be surprised if she encouraged him. And let me tell you, Inspector, her cousin paints. Quite badly, but with enthusiasm. Such connections can be dangerous." She left, having imparted her intelligence like a cat depositing a half-chewed mouse. Love, who had overheard the latter part, was exultant. "There you are, sir. Library again. Girl involved. And if Hargate's sweet on her, he might do anything to impress her, even damage a portrait." Purbright regarded him with mild amusement. "You seem, love, to have a touching faith in the romantic capacities of retired clerks." Love blushed. "Well, sir, people do foolish things." That evening, Purbright took a solitary stroll past the library. A thin drizzle made the gas lamp swim. Through the window he could see Miss Peeble shelving books with grim efficiency, while the younger Miss Phipps dealt with the last of the day's borrowers. She was fresh-faced, animated, and yes, prone to laughter that seemed entirely unsuited to so hushed an establishment. It was not difficult to imagine how a man as drab as Hargate might find in her a kind of light. Whether that light would encourage him to mischief was another matter. As he turned away, Purbright noticed something else. Ladder propped against the side of the building, its rungs damp and glistening in the lamplight. Odd, he thought, that no workmen were present. He filed the image away. The following morning brought new chatter. The Gazette ran a headline, "Police question local man in portrait outrage." Though entirely false, the suggestion was enough to provoke half the town into certainty. Mr. Hargate's name was mentioned in the marketplace, in the post office, and, most damning of all, during evensong whispered behind hymn books. Hargate himself, red-faced and trembling, stormed into the police station. "I'll not be made a scapegoat," he spluttered. "I've done nothing. You ought to be looking at that councillor fellow, Grope. He's the one with reason. Told me so himself that he'd see the exhibition made a laughing-stock, and he's not above playing dirty tricks." Purbright soothed him with tea and promised to make discreet inquiries. When Hargate had gone, Love exclaimed, "So he's shifting the blame now. He's panicking, sir." Purbright, gazing thoughtfully into his cup, replied, "Or perhaps merely reminding us that no crime in Flaxborough is ever committed without the assistance of half a dozen unpaid consultants." He let the remark hang, for he had begun to wonder, not for the first time, whether the true author of the mutilated portrait was not the hand that held the charcoal, but the town itself, its envies, its whispers, and its curious appetite for scandal. By midweek, the scandal of the portrait had begun, in that peculiar Flaxborough way, to harden into an established truth. It was no longer a question of whether the likeness of the alderman's wife had been defaced, nor even by whom, but only of how many further embarrassments the episode might yet yield. The town's imagination, once stirred, was incapable of resting. Inspector Purbright had grown used to the rhythm of these outbreaks, indignation, speculation, invention. But what he had not expected was that the mystery would provide itself with a sequel. It was Sergeant Love who brought the news, bursting into the inspector's office with his habitual lack of breath control. "Another one, sir," he exclaimed. Purbright looked up from his teacup. "Another portrait, Love? Do you mean to say our phantom draftsman has resumed work?" "Not at the hall, sir. At the library. Miss Peebles furious. Someone scrawled all over the mural in the reading room." Purbright sighed. "The mural? You mean that fearful attempt at the spirit of literature, half Athena, half seaside poster?" "Yes, sir. Only it's worse now. Someone's put a moustache on the goddess." In ink, the inspector rose at once. "Very well, we had best see it." At the library, a small crowd had gathered, peering through the doorway like theatre patrons awaiting the raising of a curtain. Inside, the mural loomed in all its faded earnestness. Minerva, bestriding a globe, her shield inscribed with quotations from Milton. The addition was unmistakable, a vigorous handlebar moustache in blue-black strokes across the goddess's serene upper lip. Miss Peeble, head librarian, stood stiff as a hatpin. Her disapproval seemed directed as much at the crowd as at the crime. "This is an outrage upon culture," she announced, "and upon me personally, for I was present in this room no more than 10 minutes before the discovery." Purbright bent close to examine the ink. It was still faintly tacky to the touch. "Did you notice anyone enter after you left, Miss Peeble?" "Only Miss Phipps," she replied icily. "And she has been with me ever since." Miss Phipps, hovering nearby, looked alarmed. "I didn't go near it, Inspector, I promise." "I make no accusations," Purbright said gently. "Tell me, was the room empty when you returned?" "Yes, except for Mr. Grope, who had come in to demand why the Gazette had not yet been removed from the reading table. He objects to the racing pages." The name was not new to Purbright. Councillor Grope's dislike of the art exhibition had already been whispered in Hargate's defence, and now here he was, again on the scene. Purbright thanked the ladies and beckoned Love aside. "Our vandal seems intent upon broadening his canvas. A moustache on Minerva, one might almost detect a sense of humour." "Then it's not Hargate, sir?" "I begin to doubt it. Hargate lacks the levity. And, as you may have noticed, his hand shakes." They visited Councillor Grope that evening. His house was a neat villa on the edge of town, its garden meticulously pruned. Grope himself received them with an air of wounded dignity. "If this is about that foolish mural, I assure you I am as much offended as anyone, more so for I warned the council against frivolous decoration. The ratepayers do not fund us to encourage artistic frippery." "Yet you were in the library shortly before the defacement was discovered," Purbright observed mildly. "Indeed, and I make no secret of it. I went to consult the financial records in the reference section. If a scrawl appeared during my brief presence, then all I can say is that the culprit must have been singularly unobtrusive, though I confess I did see Hargate lurking in the vestibule on my way out." Love's eyes brightened, but Purbright silenced him with a glance. On their way back, Love muttered, "He's lying, sir, if you can see it in his face." "Perhaps," Purbright said, "but men who lie for convenience often speak truer than they know." Note the word he used, lurking. That, I think, is how Grope sees Hargate, whether or not he was there. And a man's perceptions can be as useful to us as his facts. 2 days later, the Gazette printed another tidbit. "Culture under attack. Is there a madman at large?" The phrase was enough to send Flaxborough into delighted unease. Housewives locked their garden sheds. Booksellers reported a run on detective novels. For Purbright, the difficulty was that speculation was beginning to outpace evidence. He resolved to test the pattern. If the vandalism was deliberate, Then another outrage might follow. If it did, the site chosen would tell him more. The chance came sooner than he expected. On Saturday morning, the verger of St. Swithin's hurried into the station, ashen-faced. "Inspector, the monument to Sir Tobias Wrench, it's been tampered with." Purbright accompanied him at once. In the north aisle of the church stood the marble effigy, Sir Tobias in ruff and armour, finger-pointing heavenward. Overnight, someone had painted spectacles upon his solemn visage, neat round lenses in black enamel paint. Love gasped. "That's 3, sir, and in the church too." Purbright nodded slowly. "You observe, love, the escalation, from portrait to mural to effigy. It seems our artist is not content merely to tease the town. He must mock its symbols one by one. Then he's dangerous, sir." "Not in the usual sense," Purbright said, "but dangerous enough to its self-importance." Love's gaze swept the pews. "Shall I bring Hargate in again?" "Not yet. Hargate's role in this is becoming too convenient. I suspect we are meant to look at him." "Then who, sir?" Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. "That is precisely what the town must tell us by what it whispers next." For he had come to understand that in Flaxborough, crimes were never committed in silence. They were collaborations, woven from envy, amusement, and spite. To find the culprit, he must listen not merely for what was said, but for who most enjoyed the saying. The desecration of Sir Tobias Wrench's effigy proved to be a turning point. Unlike the portrait or the mural, this act was felt not merely as a prank but as an encroachment upon the town's dignity. Sir Tobias, though long dead, was remembered chiefly as the benefactor who had bequeathed the church its handsome organ, and, more pertinently, the funds that allowed the vestry roof to remain watertight. To tamper with his likeness was to tamper with gratitude itself. By Sunday morning, half of Flaxborough had paraded into St. Swithin's to see the offending spectacles. The other half had stayed away in moral protest, yet felt fully entitled to discuss the outrage in detail across breakfast tables. Inspector Purbright allowed the indignation to spread unchecked. He had begun to see that the vandal, or humorist, as his own private inclination described him, was as interested in reaction as in the deed. Each successive act seemed calculated to provoke a more elaborate ripple of chatter. On Monday, he sent Sergeant Love to do what Love most disliked, circulate among shopkeepers, barbers, and the queue at the post office, asking innocent-seeming questions. The results were, to Purbright's satisfaction, precisely as he had hoped. "Sir," Love reported glumly, "everybody says it's Hargate." Purbright leaned back in his chair. "How gratifying! And did they all say it in precisely the same way?" "Well, near enough. They say he's the sort, and that he has always been queer in his manner. A few even swear they saw him near the church that night." "Indeed! Remarkable, isn't it, how many eyes discover themselves only after the fact? Still, it is useful." Love frowned. "Useful, sir? If it's all pointing to him, shouldn't we just bring him in again?" "No, Love, it is too pat. A man genuinely guilty of mischief seeks to vanish. He does not stand where half a dozen tongues may place him. What we are hearing is not evidence, it is appetite. The town is hungry for a culprit they can name at leisure. That hunger tells us more about the spreader than about the supposed sinner." Love scratched his head. "So, you mean the person who keeps pushing the gossip?" "Precisely. Let us see whose voice carries it most insistently. Gossip, after all, is a weapon. Whoever wields it may be very close to the business indeed." By Wednesday, Purbright had begun to notice a curious pattern. Wherever Councillor Grope appeared, conversation about the vandalism grew livelier, more pungent. At the Conservative Club, he described Hargate's eccentric habits. In the council chamber, he urged the mayor to demand tighter supervision of odd fellows who lurk about public buildings. Even in the tobacconist's shop, he confided that certain people had long been capable of spiteful tricks. It was too eager, too rehearsed. Purbright began to think of Grope not as the culprit himself, but as someone desperately pleased with the drama. The question was, why? He resolved to test the theory. That evening, at the mayor's reception for the visiting county inspector of schools, Purbright made a casual remark within earshot of Grope. He let slip, as if from fatigue, that the police had narrowed down a suspect list to 1 or 2 unlikely candidates, neither of them Hargate. The effect was electric. Grope's face stiffened, then brightened with an unnatural cheer. Before the evening was out, half the guests had heard that the constabulary were at last on the scent of the real joker, though naturally Grope had been far too discreet to name names. The inspector smiled to himself. Gossip was a river. Once nudged, it flowed precisely where one desired. Meanwhile, the vandal remained quiet. A week passed with no new outrage. To the town, this suggested that Purbright's men had frightened the culprit into silence. To Purbright, it suggested something subtler, that the mischief-maker was watching, waiting to see how the game unfolded. He therefore contrived a little bait. With the mayor's indulgence, it was announced that the borough intended to exhibit in the town hall vestibule a newly restored bust of Queen Victoria, long kept in storage. The Gazette ran a half-column extolling its historical value. "Love," Purbright said when the article appeared. "We shall post a constable, inconspicuously, at the hall each night. Not to prevent the crime, mind you, but to note who lingers near." Love looked startled. "You mean you want the bust tampered with, sir?" "If possible, we must tempt our friend into revealing himself. Sometimes prevention is the enemy of discovery." The first night passed without incident. The second, likewise, but on the third, Constable Harrow reported that shortly after midnight he had observed a figure loitering by the town hall steps. The man had not attempted to enter, but had stood smoking for several minutes before walking off in the direction of the riverside. "Could you identify him?" Purbright asked. "Yes, sir. Councillor Grope." Purbright's expression remained bland, but inwardly he felt the tightening of the noose. Not proof, not yet, but the pattern grew clearer. Grope had placed himself at the centre of the tale from the beginning. He whispered, guided suspicion, stoked indignation. But had he also painted, inked, or scrawled? Or was he something more complex, a patron of mischief rather than its direct hand? Purbright pondered long that night. He knew one thing: a trap was nearly ready to spring. The trick would be to let Flaxborough itself, with its incurable weakness for drama, become the instrument of exposure. The prospect of the restored bust of Queen Victoria drew polite anticipation among Flaxborough's better sort. To the ladies of the Civic Improvement Society, it was another opportunity for floral arrangements and speeches. To Councillor Grope, it was one more platform upon which he might stand to display civic zeal. To Purbright, however, it was simply bait dangling on a hook. He told no one, least of all the mayor, that the unveiling ceremony had been deliberately scheduled for the following Monday, leaving a weekend during which the statue would sit temptingly alone in the vestibule. A constable continued the nightly watch, but again with strict instructions. Intervene only if genuine damage was threatened to life or property. Observe first, act later, Purbright reminded them. On Friday afternoon, Councillor Grope was seen leading 2 aldermen on a tour of the vestibule, expounding upon the importance of respecting our sovereign heritage. By evening, a whisper had made its way through the snug of the Black Swan that the police had already prevented an attempt upon the bust. By Saturday morning, the whisper had become a certainty. Everyone knew someone who swore they had overheard Purbright himself predicting that the statue would be targeted. Purbright allowed the rumour to grow unchecked. Gossip, once sown, was a crop that ripened quickly in Flaxborough's soil. It was just after dawn on Sunday that Constable Harrow came hammering at Purbright's door, breathless and pale. "The bust. Sir, something's been done to it." Within 10 minutes, Purbright and Love were standing in the vestibule. The sight that greeted them was not destruction, but a grotesque parody. Queen Victoria's marble face had been adorned with a broad comic grin painted scarlet. A pair of cardboard ears, comically elongated, protruded from either side of her head. A crown, cut from gilt paper and set askew, completed the indignity. It was ludicrous, yet calculated, not the work of a drunkard with a brush, but of someone who understood theatrical effect. Even in violation, there was a perverse craftsmanship. "God bless us," murmured Love. "She looks like one of them seaside postcards." Purbright nodded slowly. "Yes. And notice the neatness. No smears, no hesitation. Whoever did this is not unfamiliar with a paintbrush." Word spread with merciless speed. By noon, the vestibule was thronged with townsfolk, some outraged, others laughing guiltily behind their hands. The Gazette dispatched a photographer, and by evening, a hastily printed broadsheet edition bore the headline, "Royal Mockery in Town Hall Outrage." The town boiled. Letters flew to the editor. Indignation seethed from pew and parlour alike. At a special meeting hastily convened in the mayor's parlour, Councillor Grope rose to demand the severest possible penalties against the wretch who dares to deride our national symbol. His voice shook with passion, his jowls quivered. He even went so far as to declare that Flaxborough stood at the edge of moral collapse. Purbright, seated quietly in a corner, watched the performance. It was masterly, yet overripe. Grope thundered not merely as a civic guardian, but as though he himself had been personally affronted. And it was precisely this excess that told Purbright he was near the heart of the matter. Afterwards, as the councillors filed out, Purbright caught Grope by the arm. "You feel very strongly about these incidents, councillor." "I should hope so. A town without reverence is a town without roots. Do you not agree, Inspector?" Purbright's eyes twinkled. "I agree that reverence is a powerful thing. It can also be a useful curtain behind which other activities may be concealed." Grope stared, baffled, but Purbright let the silence hang before turning away with a smile. That evening, back in his office, he spread out the photographs of each outrage, the portrait with its erased face, the mural with its scarlet graffiti, the effigy with its spectacles, and now the bust with its comic crown. One by one they formed a sequence, not of mindless defacement, but of deliberate theatre. Each prank built upon the last, demanding a bigger audience. The town itself had been drawn in as collaborator, carrying the drama forward in whispers and shouts. "The hand that paints," Purbright murmured to himself, "is less important than the mind that directs." Love looked puzzled. "You mean it could be more than one person?" "Sir?" "Precisely. The brushwork may belong to a subordinate, a willing or gullible partner, but the inspiration, the orchestration, that smells of another. Someone who thrives upon attention, who feeds upon indignation, who cannot resist stirring the pot, and who, when challenged, grows ever more theatrical." "You mean Grope?" "I mean we shall soon see whether Grope is actor or audience." The next morning Purbright visited the Gazette. He asked the editor, Mr. Mounts, to print a small item in the Tuesday edition, a discreet notice that the police had secured conclusive evidence pointing toward the identity of the culprit, though details could not yet be revealed. Mounts's eyes gleamed. "You really have, Inspector?" Purbright merely smiled. "One way or another, Mr. Mounts, we shall know very soon." By Tuesday afternoon, the town was alive with speculation. Names flew thick and fast. Hargate, the bell-ringer, even young Constable Harrow, who had the misfortune of being known as artistic. But above the noise there rose one voice louder than the rest, Councillor Grope's, denouncing, predicting, insisting. That night, Purbright and Love stood once more in the vestibule, the defaced bust before them. "It will not be long now, Love," Purbright said quietly. "The showman must always outdo himself, and when he does, it will be upon a stage too crowded to hide." He straightened, listening to the faint murmur of gossip, floating even now from the taverns and parlours. The town had been baited, the trap set, not by rope or handcuff, but by the irresistible weight of its own chatter. And somewhere in the shadows, the vandal, emboldened by his own applause, was surely preparing the most extravagant performance of all. Tuesday evening found Flaxborough straining beneath the weight of its own gossip. The Gazette's coy article had worked like a bell tolling over the town. Everybody was certain that somebody knew, and nobody doubted that the unveiling of Queen Victoria's bust on Monday would provide the revelation. Even the weather seemed taut with expectancy. Clouds piled and broke in high, ragged layers. The air held that restless energy which makes curtains twitch and tempers quicken. Inspector Purbright, who neither twitched nor quickened, let it all ferment. He wandered quietly through the streets, visiting a shop here, a parlour there, listening. He wanted the town's nervous chatter to swell unchecked. The louder the noise, the more irresistible the temptation for the vandal to answer it. By Thursday, Councillor Grope had gone from indignation to something close to oratory ecstasy. At the Rotary luncheon, he thundered about moral degeneracy disguised as cleverness. At the Mothers' Union meeting, he compared the painted grin on Queen Victoria's face to a dagger thrust into the bosom of patriotism. He even went so far in the snug of the Black Swan as to wager £5 that the culprit would be publicly unmasked within the week. Love, listening to reports of Grope's peregrinations, shook his head. "The man seems almost to be enjoying it, sir." Purbright permitted himself a thin smile. "Enjoyment, Mr. Love, is rarely absent when a man senses his own hand in a drama, even if he cannot admit it aloud." Friday night passed without incident. Saturday evening, however, brought a curious report. Mrs. Clay, the church organist, swore she had seen a figure loitering about the vestibule after evensong. She described a man in a long overcoat and soft hat, standing very still by the doors. When she coughed to announce her presence, he had turned away hurriedly. She could not swear to his identity, but she was certain it was someone who should have known better. The whisper of that phrase, someone who should have known better, passed like smoke through the town. By Sunday evening, Flaxborough was as taut as a violin string. The unveiling was scheduled for noon Monday. Every citizen who could find an excuse intended to be present. The morning dawned with a brittle clarity. A weak sun sparkled off the windows of the town hall, where bunting had been strung and rows of chairs set out in prim precision. School children, fidgeting, clutched paper flags. Shopkeepers had closed their doors for patriotic duty. The mayor, perspiring in his robes, fussed with his chain of office. Councillor Grope, large and purple with importance, presided at the front like a general surveying his troops. Behind them all, calm as ever, stood Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love. At 12 precisely, the mayor rose to speak. His voice boomed in the vestibule, echoing under the high ceiling. He praised the dignity of the statue, condemned recent outrages, and extolled the resilience of Flaxborough's spirit. Then, with a gesture both tremulous and triumphant, He drew away the drapery that had been spread to conceal the bust's indignities. A gasp ran through the crowd, for there, upon the marble face of Queen Victoria, was not the scarlet grin of last week, but something new, a half-mask painted in sombre black, covering the left eye and cheek. It was grotesque, theatrical, unmistakably deliberate. The crowd erupted, shock, laughter, outrage, mingled in one wild babble. The mayor turned crimson with fury. Councillor Grope leapt to his feet, arm raised as though to smite the invisible culprit. And at that precise moment, from the rear of the assembly, a voice rang out, clear and triumphant. There is your proof. The hand of subversion mocks us even in this sacred hour. It was Grope's voice. Yet as the crowd turned, they saw not a statesman aflame with righteous wrath, but a man carried away by the very drama he had sought to orchestrate. He was trembling, his face blotched with sweat, his eyes alight with an almost boyish glee. Purbright, watching, did not move. He let the silence grow heavy as the townsfolk's gazes swung from the disfigured bust to Grope himself. The councillor's vehemence, so long admired, now seemed oddly too perfect, as if rehearsed. A murmur spread, soft, puzzled, insinuating. Did he know? Someone whispered. Why is he so quick about it? Love bent close to Purbright. Do you think he— Wait, Purbright murmured. The councillor raised his arms again. Mark my words, Inspector, your culprit sits among us, bold enough to strike at the very heart of our ceremony. Do you not see? Do you not feel the insult? His voice cracked into something near hysteria. And in that moment, Purbright saw what he had been waiting for. A man so enraptured by his own indignation that he betrayed the secret delight at its source. Purbright stepped forward at last, quiet as a shadow. Councillor Grope, he said gently, it is indeed remarkable that the paint upon that mask appears scarcely dry. Grope faltered. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Perhaps, Purbright continued, you would favour us with your handkerchief. For a heartbeat, Grope stared blankly. Then, fumbling, he drew a square of linen from his pocket. The gathered townsfolk craned to see, and a visible smear of black streaked its corner. There was a collective intake of breath. Grope stammered, It must have come from, I brushed against— But the words collapsed. The crowd's murmur grew into a tide of suspicion, of dawning recognition. Purbright folded the handkerchief carefully. You see, Councillor, outrage can be as much a disguise as indifference, and sometimes, in the eagerness to condemn, a man reveals far more than he intends. The mayor gaped. The children were hushed. The very bunting seemed to droop in embarrassment. Grope swayed slightly, then sank into his chair, a monument to deflation. The unveiling ceremony ended not with patriotic applause, but with an unsettled silence. Citizens drifted away, whispering in doorways, rehearsing versions of what they had seen. Some said Grope had been caught red-handed, others that it was a misunderstanding, but none denied that something had shifted. The Vandals' theatre had finally stumbled into daylight, and Purbright, returning to his office, allowed himself the faintest sigh of satisfaction. He had not yet closed the case, but the mask, both painted and figurative, had slipped. The morning after the unveiling was one of those oddly subdued days when Flaxborough seemed to breathe in shorter rhythms, as though reluctant to speak too loudly. Shopkeepers who had the day before chattered like magpies now confined themselves to low exchanges. The subject, of course, was Councillor Grope. Some insisted he had been fairly trapped. Others claimed the inspector had staged the whole episode to discredit a man of standing. A few, quieter than the rest, confided that Grope had always been a bit too fond of hearing his own thunder. Inspector Purbright, for his part, was not rushing to crown Grope guilty. The black smear on the handkerchief was damning, yes, but not conclusive. Paint is portable. A smear could be engineered as easily as discovered. What interested Purbright was not merely who had marked the statue, but why. By mid-morning, the councillor himself appeared at the police station. He was a pale, blotchy version of the man who had thundered before the crowd the day before. His dignity seemed packed away in a damp trunk, leaving him only a blustering determination to prove himself injured. "Inspector," he declared upon entering the office, "I must demand that my good name be cleared. My handkerchief was soiled through no act of my own. It is monstrous to suggest otherwise." Purbright rose from his chair, offered him one, and listened without interruption. He had long ago learned that silence was the most efficient prod. Grope poured out his grievance, the humiliation before the town, the sly smirks of his fellow councillors, the whispers he could almost feel pricking the back of his neck. "I tell you, I have been made a spectacle of, I, who have served Flaxborough with all the loyalty a man might summon." When at last he paused, panting slightly, Purbright spoke. "Councillor, no one wishes to see your reputation suffer unjustly. That is why we must proceed carefully. If you are innocent, as you insist, then it follows that someone has contrived to entangle you in this affair. Would you agree?" Grope blinked, startled at the suggestion. "Contrived? Yes, I suppose so. Some malicious plot." "Indeed," Purbright said gently. "And such a plotter must be one who knows your habits well enough to plant suspicion effectively. Someone who knew you would be at the unveiling, close enough to the statue, handkerchief at the ready. Someone who might profit from your disgrace." Grope frowned, though a trace of vanity softened his indignation. "Profit, eh? You think I'm envied?" "Resentment often travels in company with envy," Purbright said. "May I ask, councillor, have you any rivals upon the corporation particularly eager to see you diminished?" Grope hesitated. Then, lowering his voice, he named two fellow councillors who had opposed him bitterly over a pending land development scheme. He described their pettiness, their jealousy, their attempts to stifle his initiatives. Purbright listened, but the tale had the flavour of convenience. Rivalry, yes, but rivalry sufficient to inspire theatrical vandalism? He was unconvinced. When Grope left, somewhat soothed, though still loud, Purbright turned to Sergeant Love. "What do you think, sir?" Love asked. "That the councillor believes himself a victim, which may yet be true, but it does not follow that he is guiltless." "You mean he might be fool enough to trip himself up?" "Precisely. Vanity is as clumsy as it is loud." That afternoon, Purbright sought another voice, the vicar of St. Mark's, Reverend Sproat. He had been among those present at the unveiling, and, more importantly, had heard confessions of discontent from parishioners over the weeks. Over tea that tasted faintly of iron and overdone leaves, the vicar leaned forward. "Between ourselves, Inspector, I have long suspected Councillor Grope to be, how shall I put it, a man overly devoted to his own sense of consequence. But wicked, I cannot say. Have you heard of any quarrels, perhaps, or debts that might press upon him?" Purbright asked. The vicar nodded gravely. "Money, yes. His household runs at a pace swifter than his means. I have been asked more than once to speak charitably on his behalf to certain tradesmen, and there was, I gather, a matter of a mortgage not entirely settled." Purbright's brows drew together. Financial embarrassment, then. A motive, perhaps, if humiliation of the corporation could divert attention, or if scandal could be turned to advantage in some obscure negotiation. By evening, the inspector had traced another thread. A clerk at the Gazette, eager for reflected importance, let slip that Grope had supplied several of the more indignant phrases that appeared in the editorial column after the first defacement. He had written letters for the good of the town, though signed only with initials. Purbright considered this with mild interest. Here was a man who not only enjoyed drama but cultivated it, feeding the flames in order to stand as the figure bestriding them. Such a temperament might well create both fire and alarm. Love, digesting the day's findings, looked troubled. If he's as tangled in it as all that, why doesn't he keep quiet instead of hollering so loud? Because, Purbright said softly, he cannot. His vanity demands an audience, and vanity is forever its own betrayer. That night, Purbright walked alone through the town. The bust, now hidden again under tarpaulin, loomed ghostly in the moonlight. He paused, studying the shrouded figure. Behind the cloth lay the latest mask of defiance, crude yet cunning. He felt the question stir again, was this mere mischief, or was there a deeper design? The stillness of the square offered no answer. Only the faint creak of bunting in the night breeze, like whispers half-remembered. Back in his office he sat a while longer, turning over the pieces in silence. Grope's rage, his debts, his vanity, the rival councillors, the newspaper letters, the smear of paint, too conveniently found. It was a puzzle, but the outline of the picture was emerging. Somewhere behind the painted grin and the black mask lay not only a culprit, but a purpose. And purpose, Purbright knew, was the true quarry. For a man might commit an act of folly once, but to repeat it thrice with increasing spectacle suggested not folly at all, but intent. The inspector closed his notebook, extinguished his lamp, and allowed himself a small, secret smile. The town of Flaxborough thought the matter near its climax, but Purbright knew it had only just begun to reveal its shape.